Hello, everybody, and welcome to Medics Voices, where we talk to opinion leaders in medicine and health. And today with me, I have Dr. Sarah Newbery. So thank you very much, Sarah, for joining us. I was really keen to talk to you because of your leadership and experience in generalism and particularly rural family medicine. And I sort of wanted to start out by just asking you what drew you to rural family medicine?
Yeah, first of all, it's lovely to be here, Martina. Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I think for me, what drew me to family medicine was my experience growing up. I grew up in this small community called Hazelton, which is the most northern point on the Yellowhead Highway in British Columbia. It's mile zero to the gold rush in the Yukon. And my father was a family doctor here, and we lived actually on the hospital grounds with a group of other family doctors and the local dentist and the local maintenance guy. And there was this whole community around the hospital. And really sort of a thriving community in the hospital context. There had been a foot pump organ at the nursing station, and one of the family doctors would sit down and play most mornings. We gathered there on Christmas Day morning, and my experience of understanding rural family physicians at the time was that they were deeply connected to the community, that they made a difference not only in individual lives, but in the life of the whole community. And that appealed to me. I will say, though, too, that having grown up in this small place in the late 70s through the 80s, there were very few professions that were visible to me. I knew teachers, I knew nurses, I knew a couple of dentists. At one point, I met a lawyer. I didn't actually know what engineers did. And so when I thought about my options, I saw my options as few. And being a family doctor really appealed to me of the options that were visible to me at the time. And I'm so grateful that that's the path that I chose.
Okay. And could you because one of the things when I moved to Canada that really struck me most was how full scope general practice is here. Would you mind just for the international audience to explain, like in your day-to-day clinical practice, what that
Yeah.
actually means or looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have spent 30 years of practice in the community of Marathon. It'll be 30 years this summer, where there's a small group of family physicians. At the most, we've had 9. And as a group of family physicians, we provide all of the office-based primary care services at the top of scope. So we do have a team, but within the physician scope, we provide care there. We provide all of the inpatient care locally. We cover the emergency department 24/7 all year long. We provide obstetrical services, chemotherapy under the supervision of an oncologist who works remotely. We provide all of the palliative care and addiction services collectively. Some of the physicians with whom I work, and this is the reality of the majority of rural communities, some physicians have an interest in one area more than others, so they might do more emerge work than obstetrical work, or they might do more addictions work than emerge work. So there's a bit of a collective generalism in the context of groups of physicians here. But really it does span the breadth of that work. And I think one of the things that also can feel a bit difficult to wrap one's mind around when we think about the Northern Ontario context and much of rural Northern Canada is just what it means to be rural. So Marathon is on the north shore of Lake Superior. It's about halfway between Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay. Sault Ste. Marie has a population of about 75,000. Thunder Bay is about 150,000. Marathon, with a population of 5,000, is the largest community on the 700-kilometer stretch of road between Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay. So when we are sending a patient out, it's typically by air. The nearest larger center is just over 300 kilometers away. and sometimes that the degree of remoteness in Canada when we're talking about rural contexts can feel quite unfamiliar, I think, to an international audience as well.
And I think for me, that's sort of mind blowing that the distances are so vast.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found when I talk to students is they say, oh, I love the idea of rural, just like you mentioned at the beginning. Oh, we're around, there's that community, you get to know each other, but they're also scared. And the thought of sort of being, the responsible physician so far from, I guess what we think traditionally specialist care, although I know telemedicine has changed it a bit. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit about that in your career and what's that looked like, or if you have any stories about something like.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think so I trained for rural, I trained in Northern Ontario and had a handful of experiences during training of really realizing um, how big the responsibility was, how infrequent the big events were, and in some ways maybe the lack of frequency is a bit reassuring. The likelihood that something big is going to happen today is small, but the challenge of managing that big thing when you're not doing it every day uh, can feel quite overwhelming. I will share with you that my first emergency shift as an independent clinician in Marathon, my first patient of that first shift was actually a child who had died in the night, and they came in vital signs absent. And I was completely overwhelmed. In some ways, mercifully for me, the child was already starting into rigor mortis, had probably died a few hours earlier. And so there was very little actually to do except console an intensely grieving family and support the paramedics. But in that moment, the realization to me that I may not have been, had that child come in 2 or 3 hours earlier, would I have known what to do? Could I have managed that? Who would I have called? What if I hadn't been able to successfully resuscitate them? And that feeling was so overwhelming. And I remember at the time having a conversation with my one senior colleague. So there was a group of 6 of us who were new to practice, and we joined one guy. He was the only senior colleague in town. And I remember physically crying on his shoulder. And I don't remember if he did this literally or if it was just a feeling that he created. But I feel like he took me by the shoulders, stood me up a little straighter, and said, "It will never be as hard again as it is in this moment." Because it still makes me feel a bit weepy because it's your first day and you're new. And now this very hard moment is behind you. And I will, and we will always have each other's back. And so the experience of deep mentorship and collective community was very powerful. And I feel like that is a thread that has woven through my career, which is interesting to me, Martina, because I think when we get into medicine, we often have had to compete to do that. We pursue it quite individually. We often move through medical training quite individually. We have to pass those exams on our own as individuals. We compete for residency spots. There's this very individual approach to acceptance into medicine and then the pathway through medicine. And it can be really easy to forget that once you enter practice, uh, it is very much a collective endeavor, and we need to be doing this work together. We need to support one another. We need to have one another's back, both in the community, but also in our current era with real-time virtual support. We need to ask for help when we need it. We need to trust that people will pick up the phone when we call, and that we can support one another. And it is actually far less lonely, I think, now in the age of virtual tools than it was even 30 years ago. But that experience of realization that providing care in difficult circumstances is a responsibility that I've accepted as an individual, but that we can implement and deliver together. That was a really profound first day moment that I don't think I could have put into words on that day, but that is my reflection now of 30 years in practice, is the importance of feeling afraid and feeling committed together.
And I think it's a very strong spirit when I go to Canadian rural meetings, that sense of shared identity. I feel it's a
Yeah.
very powerful thing to experience, even as somebody who's maybe like, I'm not working in a rural context, but you really feel that sense of shared, we got each other, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think where it becomes hard for new grads in particular is when they're entering into a practice that maybe has been under-resourced for a period of time. And so the clinicians who may still be there maybe feeling a bit burned out, or maybe feeling like, oh, thank goodness you're here, I can step back. But what we really need to do as seasoned clinicians with new clinicians in the community is really lean in, support them well, even when we feel like it's a deep dig to find the energy to do that. But if we don't, we won't be able to reasonably retain them. They need to experience the support that I think many of us experienced when we entered rural practice. And when we can welcome new clinicians well and lean into supporting them and building community around them, helping them to feel like they too belong,
Mm.
both in rural medicine and in our community, in our group of colleagues, then we will have done something good for supporting them in their career the way that I felt supported in mine.
Mm. And I think you have done that through your work with NOSM. I would, do you feel that?
I do. I feel like if I come back to the geography for a moment, NOSM is 850,000 square kilometers. We can fit four of the UK into Northern Ontario. And if we did that, we'd have 240 million people in Northern Ontario, but we actually have less than a million. We have less than the population of the city of Ottawa or the city of Calgary. There's one person per square kilometer in Northern Ontario. And so sometimes, and the two campuses of NOSM University in Thunder Bay and Sudbury are 1,000 kilometers apart. And so it can feel hard to have the sense of community and connection across the breadth of that geography. But I think that's getting better at NOSM too, as we continue to use virtual tools well. And I think the conversation about professional identity and how we support professional identity for our undergraduate learners and our residents in training who are finding a way to see themselves as clinicians of service to rural communities or Indigenous communities or Francophone communities in Northern Ontario. I think that conversation is becoming increasingly rich in Northern Ontario in ways that I hope will leave our learners feeling supported in whatever path they've chosen for Northern Ontario.
Yeah. So it sounds like in the school or in Northern Ontario, there's a lot of attention to contextualizing the learner
Yeah,
experience and saying that that variety and context is actually part of the joy of generalism. And so it's like
right.
they're reframing as a sort of positive component of the type of doctor you can be.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that. I've been thinking a lot about rural generalism and what I increasingly feel as a three-stranded braid of continuity, comprehensiveness, and context. Because what we do in primary care, but more broadly as rural generalists in our hospital, in patients' homes, wherever we find ourselves providing care, that context is so important for how we are able to maintain continuity, for the expectation of comprehensiveness of scope and setting. And I think NOSM is working hard to make sure that what we offer students is culturally safe and contextually relevant. And I think those two pieces, I hope, will support our learners to feel like they can step out into practice in Northern Ontario, particularly in our rural and remote communities, and take their medical knowledge and their clinical skills and their collaborative and advocacy skills and leadership skills and apply them in a meaningful way in whatever context they choose in Northern Ontario, and really breathe life into how they serve and are of use to communities in the North, which feels exciting to me.
Yeah, it is exciting. I think it's exciting. Um, and then just on that leadership piece, because I saw that you've done a lot of leadership in your throughout your career, particularly more laterally. And this idea that as family doctors, we often are leaders in our community. I don't know if you have any, I don't know if you had any experiences or anything about being a leader in a smaller community that you might be able to share with the listeners.
Yeah, I think my leadership experience in Marathon, if I think about the local experience of that, I would say that there were two elements that really shaped how I see leadership in that context. One was in restarting obstetrical services. So when we went to Marathon in 1996, the obstetrical program had closed. And my colleague Rupa Patel in particular, she and I took on restarting the obstetrical program. And that maybe was a small L leadership, not a formal role. We dug in and rewrote policies and worked at training the nurses and creating the environment with our other colleagues in which they would feel able to commit to providing obstetrical care. And it was a really interesting process of trying to deeply understand what mattered to women and what mattered to the community and what we could be capable of as a group and as a clinical team. And the obstetrical program continues now 30 years later. I think it's one of the only obstetrical programs to reopen after being closed and be successfully sustained. And huge kudos to my colleagues who are still providing obstetrical care. I feel like that's been a really important piece. And then for me as chief of staff, finding the ways of taking what mattered locally from the standpoint of quality of care, and some of the things that we were working on locally, but understanding the value of collaborating across the region. So I worked with the tertiary center chief of staff, who was an orthopedic surgeon, Gord Porter, and we created something called the Northwest Chiefs of Staff Council, which brought together, there were only 12 hospitals across the 1,000-kilometer geography, but brought together the 12 chiefs of staff of the small rural hospitals together with the tertiary chief of staff to talk about issues that mattered to each of our settings, and particularly how we access care in the tertiary setting, how we transport people in, how we repatriate patients back. What should the expectations of quality of care be? How do we manage critical incidents when they happen in between facilities? Somebody who's transferred back inappropriately or somebody who decompensates on the way. And that experience of taking a leadership role and trying to use it to make things better for other people in leadership roles was a really valuable one as well. And I think really shaped how I understand leadership as service and leadership as trying to be of use to colleagues and of use to patients and communities. And so those two pieces, the sort of less formal leadership role that had impact on community service, and then a more formal leadership role locally that I think supported the region, feel like they are points of leadership that I feel really grateful for and really glad to have been able to learn through.
Right. With all this busy life, on call, delivering babies, covering emerge, I'm pretty sure some people are freaking out and going, did you actually have a life? Like, did you have fun? What did you do? Could you maybe tell us a little bit about, yeah, did you have a life outside medicine?
Yeah. So I will tell you that that is a question that I have asked my sons who were raised in Marathon. Do you feel like we had a life? Was I too busy? Well, I had a, because sometimes I think we do lose perspective, especially when we experience joy in our work. So I didn't, it was a rare day that I felt like work was something that I had to escape and go and do my life. Work absolutely felt like uh, an important part of my life and something that actually brought me joy and satisfaction. And I think I probably never had the right, uh, if anybody looked at hours spent, they would say, wow, your life was not very well balanced because the number of hours you spent at work compared to hours at home feels quite skewed. But when I think about what gave me energy, I often felt like the time that I spent at work was energizing and allowed me to come home and be a good mom, be a good citizen, be involved in the community. Um, and so from an energy in, energy out standpoint, it was a rare day that I felt like work took more than it gave back. And so I feel good about that. I do look back and think, wow, the reading list, the pile of books beside my bed, it doesn't go down very quickly. I'd love to spend more time reading. There's hobbies I'd like to pursue more as well, but uh, I feel really rich in friendships. I feel like I've had lovely opportunities in our community. And I feel like work has not typically been something that I felt like I needed to escape. And I'm grateful for that too. My You should interview my husband and my boys, though. They might tell a slightly different story about where they wish I had spent a bit more time, but I truly don't look back with regret about uh, how I have spent my time. And I think would say that one of the things about being a rural physician is that there is something about the role that weaves you in so well into the community. Um, and that too has felt, continues to feel really rewarding.
Yeah. And I was wondering, does nature play a role in that? Like, has that played a role in your career, I suppose? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I'm grateful to my partner Ellie, who's also a rural family dog, who has ensured that we've gone out on a wilderness paddling trip every summer. So we're unplugged and out in the bush somewhere, which has been wonderful. We have a small camp on the shore of Lake Superior that I probably haven't spent as much time there as I should have. But lots of paddling on the lake there, lots of hiking, lots of time outside. And I do feel really grateful for the opportunity to live and work in a rural setting that is surrounded by the wilderness, as opposed to sort of an agricultural rural setting. Marathon is remote on the shore of Lake Superior and is surrounded by a wilderness of water to the south and a wilderness of boreal forest to the north. Where I'm joining you today, I'm in Hazelton, where I've done a bit of locum work, and it is also surrounded by beautiful wilderness. And I think that there's something really uh, blessed about being able to look out the window and see trees and mountains and water. And I'm really grateful for that too. I think it is a phenomenon of rural practice specifically that is really wonderful.
Something I've noticed in my colleagues is they have a real appreciation of nature. Like you do have a bit of connection. Yeah.
Yeah, which I think is good for our minds. It's good for our souls.
Yeah.
Being able to connect with nature, I think, helps keep us healthier,
Yeah.
and that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you wanted to mention, or?
If there is something that I feel like I think about a lot these days, it is about the combination of high tech and high touch. And in a world that feels like it's moving quite quickly towards high tech, and AI and virtual tools, which can be tools that I think if we harness them well, we can actually provide more of the high touch care that I think is actually what benefits patients most and which benefits communities most. And I worry a little bit about what I experience to be an emerging conversation about access when we don't actually finish this sentence. Access to whom, for what, with what expectation of care in your community. And I think we can think about how we can use digital tools not to create more virtual providers who live remotely from the community, but to better support the clinicians who live in the community, to be better supported by specialists, to be able to reach out to colleagues more easily, and maybe to be able to provide some remote care when they're not in the community. But I do think a lot about the importance of the clinicians who, to use Ian McWhinney's term, both hold the map and are in the territory. And I think one of the things that we risk in a conversation about access and virtual tools only is that we risk pulling clinicians out of the territory when a big part of what makes us as individuals part of healing for people and communities is our ability to be walking in the territory. So I think about that a lot. I don't have an answer, but it is a point that I try and raise at every table I'm at when the conversation is about access and rural, that we need to keep thinking about the boots on the ground that need to be here to provide the hands-on care that people need and will always need, and in a way that ensures that people understand the territory of patients' lives. And maybe that's the last thing that I'll share.
Well, it's a powerful note to end on. So thank you so much for chatting with me. I'm very grateful.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm grateful, Martina.